because her cook Beth had been out on the streets last night, and although Mrs. Garnish didn't know it, Beth was lying dead and posthumously raped in a side doorway of Macy's. Herbert Gaines was there, incongruously dressed in a yellow safari suit and looking nervous. Nicholas sat beside him, in a sailor's sweater and jeans and rope sandals, sullen as ever. Adelaide sat possessively close to Dr. Petrie on the big floral settee, and Esmeralda sat by herself, elegant and cool in a white pleated 1930s suit. Prickles was allowed to sit in the corner, drinking Coke and reading a picture book. Mr. and Mrs. Blaufoot hadn't shown up, and it didn't look like they were going to. Kenneth Garnish had appointed himself chairman. He had a louder and harsher voice than anyone else. He sat in his biggest armchair, with a beer and a pack of cigarettes, and he formally declared the meeting open. Herbert Gaines immediately raised his hand to speak. "Mr. Garnish," he said, "I do believe we're all wasting our time. The time we should have acted was days ago, when we were first threatened by this epidemic. Instead, in spite of my own personal warnings, everybody sat back and let it happen." Kenneth Garnish sucked at his cigarette. "With all respect, Mr. Gaines, I don't think that 2 or 3 racialist speeches on television could have done anybody any good. In fact, I contend that last night's looting and rioting can be pretty largely laid at your door. You and your right-wing pressure group. Preaching intolerance isn't going to get us any place at all." "I don't think that locking ourselves away in this ivory tower is particularly tolerant," retorted Gaines. "Perhaps we ought to be more democratic about it and invite all those plague-ridden people in." "Plague has nothing to do with democracy," snapped Garnish. "The only thing we can afford to consider here is our own survival." "I'm afraid I agree with that," said Dr. Petrie. "I've seen what the plague has done, all the way from Florida, through Georgia and Alabama and the Carolinas, and there is no way that any of us can let ourselves come into contact with people who might have contracted it. We have to keep those street-level doors closed at all costs, and if we can't do that, we're going to have to build second-line defenses on the stairs." "This is absurd," said Herbert Gaines. "We're making the same mistake we made last week. We sat on our butts and let it happen. If you ask me, the only possible answer is to get out there and drive those people away. If necessary, kill them." Nicholas looked up. "Herbert," he said quietly, "you can't mean that." Herbert Gaines turned on his youthful lover with a set, angry face. "Maybe I would have meant it before, but what the hell does it matter? If you preach speeches at people, they go off mindlessly and slaughter each other. If you don't preach speeches, they're so careless and stupid that they might smother themselves in their own excrement and die of disease." Dr. Petrie said, "Mr. Gaines." Herbert Gaines waved him into silence. "Just listen to me for a moment," he said hotly. "When I made those political speeches last week, I didn't believe a single word I was saying. Not one word. I stood up there and I mouthed whatever my political friends told me to mouth. I did it because they were threatening me, or rather, they were threatening Nicholas. I suppose you could call me a physical coward, and a moral coward as well, but I did it, and I'd like to know how many people wouldn't have done the same. The insane thing was that people actually paid attention to what I was saying. The television and the newspaper reporters actually took me seriously. People actually went up to Harlem and burned down stores and houses. My God, they say that people get the politicians they deserve, and they do. If I can stand up and speak poisonous crap like that, and the American people are prepared to believe me, then I can only say that they must have won this plague in some kind of celestial competition. The plague is America's prize for stupidity, crassness, arrogance, prejudice, and intolerance." Herbert Gaines sat down. There was a long, uncomfortable silence. Nicholas reached out and took Gaines's hand and gave it a slight, almost imperceptible squeeze. "Okay, Mr. Gaines," said Kenneth Garnish at last. "You made your point. But what we need to talk about now is survival, not divine retribution." "What do we have in the way of guns?" asked Esmeralda. "If these people do break in, we're going to need them." Dr. Petrie said, "We have a rifle and 2 handguns. Not much ammunition. We can't rely on them for long. We have a baseball bat and plenty of kitchen knives if it comes to hand-to-hand stuff." Adelaide asked, "If these people have got the plague, won't they die anyway, after a few hours? Surely if we can hold out for a day or two, they'll all be dead." "The girl's right," said Garnish. "The only problem is, it's a pretty fierce mob out there, according to what the super says. The plague may get them before they get us, but we ought to be prepared in case things work out different." "I vote we go down and take a look at them," said Esmeralda. "At least we'll know what we're up against." "I second that," said Dr. Petrie, raising his hand. Esmeralda looked across and smiled at him. Herbert Gaines said, "I vote we go down there and shoot them while there's still time." Garnish stared at Gaines heavily. "Mr. Gaines," he said, "let's just take this thing one step at a time, shall we?" "I think Papa would like to come," put in Esmeralda. "If you can wait a couple of minutes, I'll go and fetch him." Eventually, armed with Dr. Petrie's rifle, 2 automatics, and Nicholas's baseball bat, they all, with the exception of Prickles, collected at the top of the service stairs and began the long descent to the street. The power was still working, but none of them wanted to trust the elevators. Ivor Glance, who had reluctantly left his mathematics for half an hour, was puffing and gasping by the time they had reached the 13th floor. "Don't you worry, Professor Glance," said Dr. Petrie. "The return journey is even more fun." "Fun my ass," growled Glance. "I'll be lucky to come out of this alive." It took them 20 minutes to reach street level. The lobby was wide, spacious, and glossy, with a veined black marble floor and walls clad in smoky mirrors. There were luxuriant potted palms and a lingering scent of expensive perfumes. The front doors of Concord Tower were of thick, tinted glass, and almost 50 feet wide. The initials CT were engraved in the glass in elegant palace script. There was a set of inner doors of the same heavy glass, but they hadn't been fitted with the same security locks as the outer ones, and they probably weren't capable of holding an angry mob back for very long. Dr. Petrie held Adelaide's arm. Outside the front doors, pressed against the glass like distorted creatures in a gloomy vivarium, was a crowd of almost 100 people. They screamed soundlessly at the building super and his 5 uniformed security men, who stood nervous but unmoving with billy clubs in their hands. The crowd's fists pounded against the armored windows. They were trying to break them with bricks and hammers and chunks of loose rubble, but so far they had only succeeded in cracking 2 of the doors and badly scratching a third. Kenneth Garnish went over to Jack, the superintendent. "How long do you think those doors can keep 'em out?" "Well, it's hard to tell," said the super. He tried to keep his eyes averted from the men and women who were shrieking insults and obscenities at them from only inches away, their faces and hands squashed white and flat against the glass. "A couple of hours, a day." "How long?" prodded Garnish. The super shrugged. "It depends. I've seen a few of them go down. I guess they got the plague out there pretty bad, but there's always more. What I'm worried about is if they find a tow truck and get a chain through those door handles." "All right, Jack," said Garnish. "If it looks like they're going to get in, don't hang around to fight them off. They won't be feeling very friendly towards you, So hightail it to the stairs and lock the fire door. Then keep climbing those stairs until you reach the first occupied floor. That's 7, isn't it? And lock the fire doors all the way. Okay, sir, I got you. Ivor Glance came across to Dr. Petrie and touched his arm. For some reason, he was looking pale. Are you okay? Asked Dr. Petrie. You look a little sick. Is your heart all right? I thought I saw someone, whispered Ivor Glance. Someone I know out there. Out there? Said Adelaide. Maybe it was someone who usually lives here, and they've been trying to get back in. Ivor Glance shook his head. He left Dr. Petrie and Adelaide and walked towards the glass doors of Concord Tower like a man who had seen a vision. Only a foot away from him, the silently shrieking crowd were thumping harder and harder at the windows and knocking chips of glass away with hammers and bricks. Dr. Petrie was horrified and fascinated at the same time. Ivor Glance stood there, staring at the crowd, his arms hanging limply by his side, while the crowd were furiously howling and shrieking and battering at the glass. Esmeralda suddenly said, "Oh, my God!" Dr. Petrie turned. "What is it?" he asked her. "Oh, what's wrong?" "Oh, my God!" breathed Esmeralda. "Just look!" Right in the forefront of the shrieking crowd was a tall, pale man with a bandage around his arm. He was staring at Ivor Glance, wild-eyed, and shaking his head from side to side in almost epileptic fear. The sight of this man had transfixed Ivor Glance, and he seemed incapable of moving. "It's Sergei Ford," said Esmeralda. "It's the Finnish man that Father's been fighting in court. Oh, my God, they've got to let him in." Dr. Petrie took her arm. "He can't. If they open those doors just an inch, then we won't stand a chance. They'll all get in. They'll kill us." "But don't you see," said Esmeralda, "if we let Sergei Ford in, he can help Papa with his work. We could finish it in days instead of weeks. Papa desperately needs help, and look, Sergei Ford could do it." Esmeralda ran over to her stepfather, but Ivor Glance turned away, as if he hadn't even seen her. He walked unsteadily back to Dr. Petrie and held out his hand. "Professor Glance," said Dr. Petrie. Ivor Glance said, "Give me a rifle." Dr. Petrie held back. "Sorry, Professor." Glance reached out and twisted the automatic weapon out of Dr. Petrie's grasp. His eyes were bright and feverish, and he almost seemed to be snuffling in rage. "Professor Glance, you can't do that. Professor Glance!" Dr. Petrie tried to snatch Ivor Glance's sleeve, but Glance pulled away, and he waved the rifle towards him. "Get away!" he said harshly. "Just get away!" He turned back towards the window and raised the rifle in his hands. The people who were pressed against the glass could see what he was going to do, but there was such a crush of people behind them that they couldn't escape. They simply opened their mouths in fear and screamed soundless screams. Sergei Ford appeared to be paralyzed with terror, and he could only stand there and watch, his hands pressed against the glass as Ivor Glance aimed at his face from only 2 or 3 inches away. "Christ!" bellowed Garnish. "Stop him! Someone stop him!" Jack, the super, made a half-hearted attempt at a football tackle, but Glance stepped back and smacked him away. Before anyone else could move, he had lifted the rifle again and fired into the glass. The whole door collapsed outwards in huge slices. Nearly 1/4 of a ton of reinforced glass sheared into hands, faces, upraised arms, and broke on the ground outside with a horrific, flat, ringing sound. The shrieking of the crowd filled the lobby with hideous noise, cries of pain and terror, and cries of frustrated fury. They flooded into the reception area, trampling over dead and dying bodies, and Ivor Glance was swept away like a man carried out to sea. "Back to the stairs!" bellowed Kenneth Garnish. "Back to the stairs!" Dr. Petrie seized Adelaide and Esmeralda by the hand and pulled them towards the emergency stairs. Kenneth Garnish pushed them hurriedly through, and Herbert Gaines, whimpering in fright, followed after. Nicholas was hitting at a bloody-faced vagrant with his baseball bat, and just managed to push him away and duck through the door to the stairs before a mob of screaming men reached him, waving clubs and knives. Kenneth Garnish slammed the door, locked it, and dropped the bolt across it. They heard the crowd bang up against the other side like an avalanche. "Papa!" cried Esmeralda. "Where's Papa?" Kenneth Garnish reached out and held her arms. "Miss Baxter was no good. I couldn't keep the door open any longer." "You mean he's still—" "He wouldn't have felt very much, believe me." "He's still out there? You mean he's still out there?" "Miss Baxter, it was his own fault. If he hadn't fired that shot—" "They'll kill him!" screamed Esmeralda in an almost unbearably high-pitched voice. "They'll kill him!" Kenneth Garnish said to Adelaide, "Please take her upstairs, will you? We have to get out of here. Unlock all these fire doors." "You have to let me through," said Esmeralda. "I have to get him out of there." Garnish stood firm. "Miss Baxter, it's impossible." "I demand that you let me through," insisted Esmeralda, suddenly haughty. Kenneth Garnish shook his head. "Come on, Miss Baxter, let's just get out of here." Esmeralda glared furiously for a moment, but then her face softened and collapsed with anguish. "Oh, God," she sobbed. "It's my fault. Oh, God, it's all my fault. He was so good. You don't even understand." "We understand," said Herbert Gaines consolingly. "You don't," shrieked Esmeralda, off-key and hysterical. "He was my lover." They locked and bolted every fire exit up to the 9th floor, and when they were there, they took the added precaution of levering open the elevator doors and wedging them with a long gilt settee. The elevators had been switched off by now, but they just wanted to make sure that the furious mob downstairs didn't get them working again. "Listen to that," said Kenneth Garnish, leaning over the open elevator shaft. Dr. Petrie listened. From the 1st floor, there was a sound like strange trolls at the bottom of an echoing drain. Screams and hoots and cries. "Did you ever see the third man?" said Garnish. "You remember the scene at the top of the Ferris wheel? When they looked down to the people below like dots, and Harry Lime says something like, 'Would you feel any pity if any of those dots stopped moving forever?' Well, what would you say if one of those animals down there stopped screaming? Maybe Gaines was right. When it comes down to it, just show me one American who gives a fuck about any other American." Dr. Petrie said, "I'm a doctor, Mr. Garnish, and I try to give at least half a fuck." Kenneth Garnish looked at Dr. Petrie narrowly. "You think I'm wrong, don't you, for the strike and all that?" "Does it matter?" Garnish looked down into the depths of the elevator shaft. The distorted screams and groans continued. "What matters to me, Dr. Petrie? I stood up for a principle I believe in. If the whole of America has to die for that principle, then I still believe it's worth it." "Even if the principle kills the very people it's supposed to protect?" Kenneth Garnish turned away. "Principles are everything, Dr. Petrie. Without principles, we cease to be living beings." Herbert Gaines came up. His yellow safari suit was smudged with dust, and his leonine hair was sticking up like fuse wire. "I'm sorry to interrupt this debating society, but I think we ought to start barricading our apartments. Maybe we ought to see what food we have available, too, and share it out." Esmeralda, who was calmer now, almost uncannily calm, was sitting at the opposite end of the 9th floor landing, smoking a cigarette. We have a whole freezer full, she said. Lamb, beef, hamburger, chickens, turkeys, vegetables. I guess we can hold out for months. So have we, nodded Garnish. How about you, Mr. Gaines? Nicholas spoke for him. Oh, we're fine too, aren't we, Herbert? I think our supplies lean a little heavily on ready-made goulash, but I suppose my digestion can just about stand it. Herbert had one of his cooking jabs last month, and goulash is the only damn thing he can do. Herbert Gaines turned around angrily. What's the matter with my sole Veronique, or my couscous? Nicholas sighed. Oh, Herbert, they're lovely. Can't you ever take a goddamned joke? Dr. Petrie took Adelaide by the hand. I suggest we all stay in one apartment. You can lock all your valuables up in your own apartments, but if we all stay in separate places, we've lost any means of communication. Supposing the mob gets up here and breaks open your door, Mr. Gaines, or yours, Mr. Garnish, and you've got no way of calling out for help from the rest of us. I think Dr. Petrie has a point, said Kenneth Garnish. We can move beds and food into one condo and defend it together. Esmeralda stood up. She was white-faced, and her eyes were smudges of shadow. She looked like Ophelia, drowning in the weeds. If we're going to do that, she said, we'd better use my place. We have a closed-circuit TV on the door, and apart from that, the settee in the den turns into a double bed. Is that agreed, then? Said Mr. Garnish. What about Mr. and Mrs. Blaufoot? Asked Herbert Gaines. Don't you think we ought to have a word with them? While the rest of the survivors shifted beds into Esmeralda's apartment and carried in food and belongings, Kenneth Garnish went up to Mr. and Mrs. Blaufoot's door and rang the bell. There was a long pause. Then Mr. Blaufoot said, Who is it? It's me, Mr. Blaufoot, Mr. Garnish from downstairs. Can you open the door? There was another long pause. Then Mr. Blaufoot said, Leave us alone, we're all right. Kenneth Garnish sighed. Mr. Blaufoot, he said, leaning against the door, you have to know that a mob of people have broken into the tower. They could be coming upstairs to make trouble. Apart from that, you probably got plague. Now can you open the door? He heard the locks and bolts being drawn back, and the solid mahogany door was opened an inch. Mr. Blaufoot's glittering eyes looked out from the darkness. Mr. Blaufoot, please, said Garnish. Mr. Blaufoot opened the door all the way and stepped back. Kenneth Garnish walked into the thick carpeted condominium and was surprised to find that it was in darkness. Across the room, sitting in a tall carved chair, Mrs. Blaufoot sat in a black dress, pale and red-eyed. You folks all right? Said Garnish. Is there anything wrong? The Blaufoots were silent. Mr. Blaufoot walked over and stood next to his wife. Kenneth Garnish looked at them uneasily. Then he saw the framed photograph on the small, polished Regency table, just in front of Mrs. Blaufoot. He stepped over and carefully picked it up. She looked very much like Mrs. Blaufoot. Mrs. Blaufoot said coldly, Put it down, please. Garnish frowned, but he laid the photograph back on the table. He said huskily, Is this your daughter? Mr. Blaufoot nodded. Yes, Mr. Garnish, it is. We heard about her on Sunday morning, shortly before the telephone system went dead. A relative of ours had managed to escape from Florida early in the plague, and he was able to get to St. Louis. This relative has seen her. And is she all right? Said Garnish. Then he looked around at the closely drawn drapes and Mrs. Blaufoot's black dress and said, Well, no, I guess she's not. I'm sorry. That was clumsy of me. She's dead, Mr. Garnish, said Mrs. Blaufoot. She died of lack of medical attention with bronchial pneumonia. She didn't even have plague. The medical workers were out on strike and my daughter died. Mr. Blaufoot added, as if it made any difference. She was going to be a concert pianist. Kenneth Garnish coughed. He hardly knew what to say. In the end, he muttered, "Listen, I'm really very, very sorry." Mrs. Blaufoot stared at the screwed-up handkerchief between her bony hands. "Sorry isn't really enough, is it?" Garnish shrugged. "No, I guess it isn't. But I am sorry, and there's nothing more I can say. I acted when I called that strike according to my lights." Mrs. Blaufoot looked up. "In that case, Mr. Garnish, I hope that your lights soon go out, like ours did." During the night, most of the 60 or 70 people who were huddled together in the lobby of Concord Tower died of plague. The black floor and the polished mirrors on the walls reflected their painful, grotesque faces as the bacilli swelled their joints and clogged their lungs. Their groaning and whimpering echoed like a terrible chorus of damned souls, but it wasn't the worst noise. The worst noise was the rustle and scamper of rats, big gray sewer rats, as they scuttled over the sleeping and dying bodies and gnawed at dead and living flesh alike. Some of the rats sniffed at the locked fire door, which even the angriest riders hadn't been able to break down, and some of them poured into the open elevator doors and dropped, with a soft thud of furry bodies, down to the basement. They scented warmth, and they scented food, and they began to climb, twisting their way up the elevator cables. The empty shaft echoed with their twittering and squeaking, and the scratching of their claws on the steel wires. Eventually, they reached the 9th floor, where the doors were wedged, opened by the gilt settee, and they ran out of the elevator shaft and onto the landing. The upper fire doors had been left open, and they wriggled and pattered up the stairs, sniffing at locked apartment doors and overrunning floor after floor. In 3 hours, the stairs and landings of Concord Tower, right up to the roof level, were a scampering mass of ravenous rats. Dr. Petrie was deeply asleep when someone touched his forehead. He stirred and unconsciously tried to brush the hand away. He had been dreaming about Miami, and he thought he had been eating a picnic lunch on the beach with Prickles and Anton Selmer. He opened his eyes and found himself in the den of Ivor Glance's condominium, lying on the settee now, converted into a double bed. Esmeralda whispered, "Shh." He could see her in the gloom, her face pale and sculptured. She was wearing her black curly hair tied back with a ribbon, and she smelled warmly of arpege. "What is it?" he whispered back. "Shh," she repeated. He looked quickly to one side and saw that he was now alone in the bed. He had been sleeping with Kenneth Garnish, while Adelaide and Prickles and Mrs. Garnish shared the master bed in the main bedroom. Esmeralda said, "Garnish couldn't sleep. He's in the kitchen having a smoke and reading a book." "He reads books?" joked Dr. Petrie. "You amaze me." "Don't talk," said Esmeralda, laying a finger across his lips. "Even walls have ears." Without another word, she lifted the bedsheets and climbed in beside him. The bed creaked, and she suppressed a giggle. Then she curled her arms around him, and she was all soft and warm and slithery in her pure silk nightdress. "We can't do this," hissed Dr. Petrie, in spite of the fact that his body was all too obviously saying he could. "Don't talk," said Esmeralda. "Just remember what I've been through and give me a chance." He sat up and held her wrists. He could see her moist lips gleaming in the dim light of the den. "Esmeralda, we can't do this." "You're a doctor, aren't you?" "Sure, but nothing. If you're a doctor, you know the importance of therapy after a psychological shock. I don't want love, Leonard. I just need a few moments oblivion." He didn't release her wrists, Thanks for the compliment, he whispered. Now I'm only good for a few moments' oblivion. You know I didn't mean that. Well, what did you mean? I mean that this is an emergency, a medical and psychological and romantic emergency. For Christ's sake, Leonard, we could all be dead tomorrow. Don't you believe in final grand gestures? If I believed in final grand gestures, I'd be lying dead as a doornail in Miami, Florida. What's that got to do with us making love? I don't know. Well, kiss me, she said, and I'll show you. He could have resisted. He could have said no. But her long, warm thigh moved against his bare leg, and her hand reached down and cupped his tightened balls, and her sexuality washed over him like a wave of drunkenness. He leaned forward and kissed her, and their tongues touched, and their teeth bit. They didn't say a word. She pushed him back against the bed and sat astride him, lifting her glossy silk nightdress around her hips. He reached up and felt her hardened nipples through the slippery material, and she sighed and kissed his forehead and raised herself up so that he could socket himself between her thighs. Then she slowly sat down on him, squirming her hips as she did so that he felt a massaging warmth rising up him. The door of the den was still ajar. They knew that anyone could walk in at any moment, but they made love slowly and relished every sensation it brought until they couldn't suppress their urgency anymore, and they were panting at each other with bright eyes and expressions of something like pain. Esmeralda twitched and shook violently. Leonard Petrie felt something grip him between the legs, and they both achieved the few moments of oblivion they were looking for. Then they were lying side by side, quiet and wet, and even if it wasn't a final grand gesture, it was at least a kind of temporary therapy for traumatized minds that had been through more emotions and horrors than it was possible to take. Dr. Petrie kissed her. You'd better go now, he said, gently. Mr. Garinish is a fast smoker. Esmeralda cuddled him close and pressed her lips against his side. Kenneth Garinish, in blue striped pajamas, put his head around the door and said, Hey, you two, don't hurry on my account. I'm just going to finish this chapter. He was wakened by the sound of a helicopter. He sat up, listening. Esmeralda had long since gone, and Kenneth Garinish was lying next to him with his face buried in the pillow, snoring. The helicopter noise came and went, as if it was circling around somewhere in the vicinity. He climbed out of bed, tugged on his pants, and went to the window. At first, he couldn't see where it was. The noise of the rotors was bounced off buildings in all directions. The sky was gray with cloud. But then he saw it, turning around the 38-story United Nations Plaza building and circling towards Concord Tower with its blades flickering and its navigation lights shining through the murk. Kenneth Garinish sat up, rubbing his eyes. What's going on? He grunted. It's a helicopter, said Dr. Petrie. It's been circling around here for a couple of minutes. Maybe it's the cavalry. Garinish swung his legs out of bed and came to take a look. Some hopes, he said. They probably just come for a snoop at the doomed survivors. Do you think we ought to wave? Said Dr. Petrie. There's always a chance they're looking for people to rescue. Do what you like, said Garinish. The helicopter was really close to the tower now, circling slowly around and shining a powerful light in their direction. It was a small two-seater Bell with a Perspex bubble cockpit. Dr. Petrie waved both hands. At that moment, Herbert Gaines pushed into the room. hastily tying his Japanese bathrobe around his waist. "Is that a helicopter?" he asked. "Well, it ain't a June bug," said Kenneth Garnish. "They've come," said Gaines. "They said they've come, and they have." Adelaide came into the room and took Dr. Petrie's arm. "Leonard, what is it?" Herbert Gaines was elated. "It's the people from Washington. They called me on Saturday when the first news of the plague leaked out. They said they'd bring in a helicopter to rescue me, and here they are." "Well," said Dr. Petrie, looking at Kenneth Garnish, "it looks like politics pay and principles poop out." Garnish shrugged. Herbert Gaines went to the window and flapped his arms about frantically. For a while, it didn't look as if the helicopter pilot had seen him, but then the dazzling searchlight probed into the apartment window, and Herbert Gaines was lit up like an actor on a stage. "I'm here!" he shrieked. "I'm here! I'm here!" They saw the helicopter pilot pointing towards the roof, and then the machine turned a half circle and rose out of sight. Herbert Gaines, whimpering with excitement, rushed into the sitting room and pulled on his yellow safari suit. The rest of them watched him in tense silence. "Well," said Herbert, lacing his shoes, "I think I'm ready to go." Nicholas, scruffy from sleep and wearing nothing but a dark brown bath towel, said, "Is that it? You're just going?" Gaines stopped lacing his shoe and looked up. Then he cast his eyes around at everybody else, saw their expressionless, unsympathetic faces, and bit his lip. "Well, yes, yes." "What about me?" said Nicholas. "You're just leaving me here, and what about all these other people?" Herbert Gaines lowered his eyes. "Nicky," he said, "the helicopter only has room for one. You saw that. It's a two-seater. I can't take anybody with me." Garnish coughed. "Couldn't we draw lots?" he said gruffly. "Or maybe one of the ladies should go instead." "Listen," said Gaines, almost desperate. "It's up there now. It's waiting. It won't wait forever." Garnish examined the floor. "You're an old man, Mr. Gaines," he said harshly. "You're an old man, and you've had a long life. Now supposing one of these young ladies went instead of you. Or what about Nicholas here? He's a good friend of yours. Don't you think enough of Nicholas to give up your place in that chopper and let him live?" Herbert Gaines stood up. "They sent the helicopter for me," he insisted. "The only reason it's here is because of me. The party needs me, and that's why they've taken the risk. What do you think they're going to say if that thing flies all the way back to Washington with Nicky aboard? Do you think they've spent all that money and wasted all that energy just to educate a half-educated faggot who can't even cook?" Nicholas stared, open-mouthed, at Herbert, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Garnish grunted. "If that's how you feel, Mr. Gaines, perhaps you'd better just get the hell out. I don't think any of the rest of us would like to stand in the way of your cowardice, seeing as how it's so pressing." Gaines said, "Look, as soon as I get to Washington, I'll make sure they send another helicopter back. A bigger one for all of you." Garnish flapped a hand at him. "Don't bother. You might strain your brain trying to remember to do it, and we'd hate to see that happen." Adelaide said, "Mr. Gaines?" Herbert Gaines was buttoning up his safari suit and making for the door. "Yes," he said. Adelaide didn't answer at once. Not until Herbert Gaines had turned around and looked at her. "I saw your movie once, Mr. Gaines." Herbert Gaines' mouth twitched. "My dear, the helicopter's waiting. I really can't." Adelaide said, "I like the line when Hannah Carson says to Captain Dashfoot, 'Oh, you brave, brave, honorable man. With the world, we're all like you.'" Gaines paused. In a quiet voice, he said, My dear, you've got a regrettably good memory. He stood at the door, his hand on the latch, so obviously striking a tragic, theatrical pose that Nicholas said, "For Christ's sake, Herbert, just fuck off." Herbert Gaines lifted his lion-like head. "I will send more helicopters," he said in his richest voice. "I promise you that, upon my life." He opened the door. He was so involved in his melodramatic pose that when the rats rushed at him, their heavy bodies thumping against the half-open door, he was taken completely by surprise. The rats leaped and jumped at him, and more of them scuttled into the apartment and disappeared under the makeshift bed and into the drapes. Dr. Petrie ran across the sitting room and banged himself against the door so that it slammed shut. He crunched 4 or 5 rats in the door jamb, and they squealed and writhed, with blood running out of their narrow noses. Adelaide and Esmeralda and Mrs. Garnish, panting with fright, picked up cushions and brooms and chased after the rats that had managed to get into the apartment. Herbert Gaines had a rat swinging from his sleeve. He flapped at it uselessly until Kenneth Garnish picked up a heavy cigarette lighter from the table and knocked the rat away. Then he stepped on its head and killed it. "Oh, Mother of God!" gasped Gaines. "Oh, Mother of God!" "Well, darling," said Nicholas, turning to Herbert Gaines, "so much for your helicopter now." Herbert Gaines was shaking. "I'm still going," he said. "Don't think that a few rats can stop me." "A few?" said Dr. Petrie. "Did you see how many there were? The whole building must be thick with them." Herbert Gaines said, "It won't wait, you know. The helicopter won't wait." Kenneth Garnish was helping his wife to corner the last stray rat and beat it to death. He came over to Herbert Gaines with blood on his hands. Behind him, Mrs. Garnish had suddenly gone into a burst of hysterical weeping, and Esmeralda was trying to soothe her. "Mr. Gaines," he said, "you're crazy. If you go out there, you won't last 2 minutes. Those rats are fierce and they're hungry. I've come up against them before when I was a kid, and I've seen a man have half his nose bitten off. That was just one. There must be hundreds out there." Dr. Petrie looked at the old actor and said, "It's no use, you know, Mr. Gaines. You might as well admit it." Herbert Gaines looked up at the ceiling. Just a few stories above him, perched impatiently on the roof, was his means of escape, his way to a glittering political destiny. Kenneth Garnish said, "Power's an attractive thing, Mr. Gaines, ain't it? You've tasted it now, haven't you? And wasn't that taste good?" Herbert Gaines stared at him. "I don't know what you mean. I have to go, that's all. They sent the helicopter, and I have to go." He paced urgently across the room. Then he said, "Fire, that's it. They don't like fire." "Mr. Gaines," said Garnish, "what the hell are you talking about?" "It's true," said Gaines. "You can always fight them with fire. It's in that movie, Riverboat. Now where's that variety we brought down with us? Nicky, where is it?" Nicholas, sulking, didn't even answer. Herbert Gaines fumbled around in his tousled bed until he found the paper. He rolled it up and brandished it around. "This, my friends, will be my salvation." He picked up the table lighter that Garnish had used to kill the rat, and he flicked it. Then he carefully applied the flame to the edge of variety until the paper was burning like a torch. Dr. Petrie stepped forward, but Kenneth Garnish reached out and held his arm. "Let him go, Doctor. Just help me make sure that no more rats get into the place. You can't stand between a man and his destiny, even if you think he's a shit." Dr. Petrie said, "But it's insane. He won't last a minute out there. That's his problem. He wants to go." Nicholas, standing next to them, nodded his head. "You're right, Mr. Garnish. Herbert's a born martyr. You'd have to kill him to stop him killing himself." Herbert Gaines was making sure that the copy of Variety was well alight. Then he went to the door and held it in front of him. "You wait till they see this," he said triumphantly. "This'll sort them out." Dr. Petrie and Kenneth Garnish positioned themselves behind the door so that they could slam it shut the second that Herbert Gaines had gone through. The room was already smoky and filled with black wisps of ash, but Herbert had his paper burning well now and was ready to go. He opened the door, waving the blazing variety in a wide, fluttering arc. The rats went for his legs like gray grease torpedoes, but the flames were enough to keep them from jumping at his face and throat. Kicking 3 or 4 rats away, Dr. Petrie shut the door again and locked it. Herbert had 3 flights of stairs to go to reach the roof. The first flight wasn't too bad, because he managed to knock most of the rats away from his legs, and his paper was still burning. Halfway up the second flight, with his heart pounding and his 60-year-old lungs beginning to feel the strain, he started to falter. The flames abruptly went out, and he was left with nothing but a half-burned variety to beat off the most vicious animals he had ever seen. The third flight was the beginning of his cavalry. The rats were hanging onto his arms now and biting into his back and his sides. His legs were thick with them, and he could feel their teeth in his thighs. He kept his hands over his face and stumbled up blindly, but they still leapt up at him and bit into his fingers until his hands were gloved in rats. The agony of it was enormous. He couldn't even cry out, unless they bit into his mouth, and there was already a huge brown sewer rat dangling from the soft flesh under his chin. He tried to keep his mind above the pain, above this dreadful cloak of biting, squeaking creatures, and firmly concentrated on the roof and his wonderful helicopter. He had to take one hand away from his face to open the door to the roof. His arms seemed to weigh hundreds of pounds, and it was swinging with rats like the fence round a trapper's cabin. One of the beasts launched himself at his cheek, and he lost precious seconds hitting it away. The helicopter pilot was a 36-year-old veteran called Andy Folger. He was checking his watch impatiently when the roof door opened, and the first thing he did was start up his engine and get his rotors turning. He cast a quick eye over the fuel reading, and then reached over to open the opposite door of the cockpit. The quicker he got this mission over, the better he was going to like it. He heard a muffled screaming noise, and he turned. He had a feeling in his stomach like an elevator dropping 30 floors in 10 seconds. Folger stared at the hunched heap of wriggling gray fur that was moving towards him. He couldn't understand what he was seeing at first, and when he did, his mind almost blanked out. He didn't see the rats that ran out of the open door to the stairs and scuttled across to his helicopter. He reached over to close the cockpit door again, and one of them leaped up and bit his hand. He banged the rat against the side of the cockpit, but it clung on, and while it clung on, another rat jumped into the helicopter, and another. He beat the animal away from his hand, revved the engine, and pulled back the stick. The helicopter's rotors whistled faster and faster, and the bell lifted off from the rooftop and circled away towards the north. 3 rats scurried around the cockpit, and one of them jumped at Folger's face. He tried to smack it away, but then another rat nipped at his arm. The helicopter went out of control. Wrestling against twisting rats and a bucking control stick, Andy Folger saw the horizon turn upside down and the buildings of First Avenue swivel all around him. He saw streets, sky buildings, streets, and then the helicopter fluttered and twisted and plummeted 18 stories. It fell onto the glass roof of a supermarket and exploded in a hot spray of fire that rolled upwards and burned itself out. On the top of Concord Tower, Herbert Gaines neither saw nor heard. His mind was still somewhere inside that costume of rats, but it was dwindling very quickly and was soon to be gone. Sometime during the afternoon, the power from their generator died. They were sitting quietly around the apartment, and the light suddenly dimmed and went out. They heard the freezer motor in the kitchen shudder and stop. Dr. Petrie, who had been sitting on the settee with Prickles, reading her a story, looked up. "Daddy," said Prickles, wide-eyed, "it's gone dark." Kenneth Garnish got out of his armchair and went to try the lights. There was no doubt that they were dead. He shrugged and said, "It's the generator. The goddamned thing's probably clogged up with rats." Esmeralda, sitting cross-legged on the floor, said, "Oh, what are we going to do now? All our food's going to spoil. I doubt if we've got enough canned stuff to last us a week. There are 6 of us, right? 7, including Prickles, and I don't think we've got more than 9 or 10 cans of meat and a few dozen cans of fruit. Maybe I should check." "Jesus," said Nicholas, "that's all we need." Kenneth Garnish lit a cigarette. "I thought you'd be pleased. Now you won't have to force yourself to eat Herbert's goulash." "Ken, I don't think you ought to speak ill of the dead," said his wife worriedly. "Why not?" said Garnish, blowing smoke. "That was what he wanted, wasn't it? A glorious fiery plunge from the top of the city's ritziest apartment." Nicholas lowered his head and sighed. "I don't know what he wanted, Mr. Garnish. He was actually very kind, except to himself, that is." Dr. Petrie put down the storybook and stood up. "I think the most important thing now is to work out how we're going to survive. What is it, Tuesday? I guess anyone who was left on the streets on Sunday will be dead of plague by now. It should be pretty safe outside as far as looters and muggers are concerned." "And what about rats?" asked Adelaide. Dr. Petrie ran his hand through his hair. "I'm not sure about rats. If anything, well, the rats will probably have gotten worse." "So what are we going to do?" asked Mrs. Garnish. "I mean, those rats are so fierce. I can't bear the thought of them." "The water's off," called Esmeralda from the kitchen. "That means we don't even have anything to drink." "Plenty of whiskey," said Garnish wryly, holding up Ivory Glance's crystal decanter. "Does anyone here have a car?" Dr. Petrie asked. "A car?" frowned Garnish. "What the hell do you want with a car?" "Well," said Dr. Petrie, "if the rats are really bad, then it's going to be too dangerous for all of us to get out of here at one time. It only needs one person to trip or fall, and the whole party could be put at risk. But if 1 or 2 could wrap themselves up in blankets or something, and make protective helmets to cover our faces, then maybe we could make it to the basement car park." "Then what happens?" said Garnish. "This is a dead city. Where do you think you're going to get help?" "You have enough food for 2 or 3 days. That's all it should take to drive out of the plague zone and organize some kind of airborne rescue. Let's not kid ourselves. You're all wealthy people, and if anyone can get rescued, you can." Mrs. Garnish furrowed her brow. "Well, supposing we don't get rescued," she said anxiously. "What then?" Kenneth Garnish reached over and took her hand. "Gay," he said gently. "We've never talked like that, and we never will. The doctor's right. We've got as good a chance as anyone." Dr. Petrie went to the walnut sideboard and picked up a heavy sheaf of papers. "More important than any of us, though," he said, "is this." Mrs. Garnish peered at the sheaf suspiciously. "What's that?" she asked sharply. "This is the mathematical work on the plague that Ivory Glance left unfinished," explained Dr. Petrie. "I'm not a research scientist, but I've looked through it, and as far as I'm able to understand, it's sound. I think that if we can get these papers to the federal government, we can persuade them to investigate the idea further. And with any luck at all, we could help to stamp out the plague. Whoever gets out of here will not only have the task of sending help to the rest, but they'll have the vital responsibility of delivering these papers to the Department of Health." "Well, how do we know the whole country hasn't been wiped out?" said Nicholas. "I mean, Jesus, the whole of New York in 3 days?" Dr. Petrie riffled through the papers of equations and formulae. "We don't know. The last we heard, they'd managed to hold the plague of the Alleghenies. Maybe the situation's worse by now. It probably is. But if we can get these papers to Washington in time, well, who knows? We might be able to save the Midwest and the West Coast. Kenneth Garnish said, "Well, that sounds impressive enough. You could have had my car, but I left the keys in my apartment." "Esmeralda?" asked Dr. Petrie. "How about you?" "Well, I left mine parked on the street," said Esmeralda. "I expect it's a total wreck by now." Nicholas said, "I should think that Herbert's Mercedes is okay. It's in the basement. I have the keys here. He always left them with me." Kenneth Garnish looked at him appreciatively. "Looks like Captain Dashfoot did us a good turn after all." "Oh, it's only a two-seater," said Nicholas. "There's a kind of small contingency seat at the back, but you couldn't travel for very far in that." Kenneth Garnish opened the cigarette box on the table and took out the last of Ivor Glance's cigarettes. "In that case," he said, striking a light, "I suggest that Dr. Petrie goes and takes his daughter along with him. Prickles would fit in the back, wouldn't you, Prickles?" Prickles nodded shyly. Dr. Petrie said, "No, this has to be fair. I suggest we draw straws and give everybody a chance." Garnish pulled a face. "Don't talk dumb. Supposing Gay draws it. How's she gonna get out of this goddamn rat-infested building, drive all the way to Washington, and then convince the Federal Department of Health that she's found a way to cure the plague? Gay couldn't convince the Mothers Union that fish paste sandwiches are better value than bagels and lox." "Ken," said Mrs. Garnish, hurt. Garnish put his arm around her. "Don't take it the wrong idea, Gay, but it's true. Dr. Petrie has to go. It's his idea anyway. Can you imagine me trying to sell it? You know what they think of me in Washington right now, or Nicholas here, in his sailor's suit." "There's still a spare seat," said Dr. Petrie. Adelaide, sitting next to him, looked up. She frowned and said, "But surely—" "That's true," said Garnish, interrupting her. "We can draw lots for that. Esmeralda, do you have any drinking straws?" "Of course," said Esmeralda, and went into the kitchen to fetch them. Adelaide tugged gently at Dr. Petrie's sleeve. He turned around. "Leonard," she whispered, "I thought that—" He put his finger to his lips. "Don't worry. Whatever happens, it'll be okay." "But I want to go with you." He laid his hand over hers. "Darling, we're all in this together. We all have to take the same risks. Trying to get out of here is going to be far more dangerous than staying. If you ask me, Herbert Gaines didn't even make it upstairs." "Well, that's not the point." "Shh," he said. Esmeralda had come back with the straws. She handed them to Dr. Petrie, along with a pair of kitchen scissors. "Okay," said Garnish. "Cut them to different lengths, and whoever draws the longest straw gets to go. Agreed?" Dr. Petrie trimmed the straws. Keeping his back turned, he arranged them in his hand. Then he walked over and offered them to Nicholas. Nicholas plucked out one quickly, with his eyes shut. "It's a short one," he said. "I know it is." He held it up. It was. Dr. Petrie moved across to Kenneth Garnish. The old Union leader thought for a while, rubbing his chin, and then he carefully picked the straw in the middle. It was longer than Nicholas's straw, but it was still short. He shrugged and twisted it up. Mrs. Garnish was next. She was dithering and anxious. She didn't actually want to pick the longest straw, because she preferred to stay with her husband, but she knew how insistent he was on playing by the rules. If she picked it, it would make her go. She pulled one out. It was short. She let out a big puff of relief. Adelaide looked across at Esmeralda. "Her first," she said to Dr. Petrie. Dr. Petrie shook his head. "I'm going around the room clockwise," he said. Adelaide lifted her eyes and stared at Dr. Petrie for a long moment. He stared back, sadly. They say that a woman can always sense when a man no longer wants her. and he wondered how it showed. He wondered, too, when he had stopped wanting her. It hadn't happened all at once, and it was nothing to do with Esmeralda. What had happened last night had been no more than a human attempt to feel something after so much misery. Maybe the whole experience since the beginning of the plague had changed him, and made him come to terms with what he really was and what he wanted to be. It seemed to him now that Adelaide was part of a life that had become remote and irrelevant, like tennis and swimming and Normandy Shore's golf club. "Pick," he said softly, holding out the 2 remaining straws. Adelaide picked. Dr. Petrie held out the last straw to Esmeralda. She didn't look at him, simply took it and held it up. Esmeralda's straw was fractionally longer than Adelaide's. "There you go, then," said Kenneth Garnish loudly. "That settles that." Esmeralda stood up. She kept her eyes downcast, and she said simply, "I'll get my things together." Adelaide shrieked out, "You won't!" Dr. Petrie held Adelaide's shoulder. "Darling, it was a fair draw. I can't do anything about it. We had to decide somehow." "I'm left behind while you're going," said Adelaide. There were angry tears running down her cheeks. "You didn't have to pick a stupid straw." "Come on now," put in Kenneth Garnish. "I thought we decided all that." "Well, decide again," snapped Adelaide, the tension of all she had been through giving her a note of desperation. "Leonard is my fiancé, and that's all there is to it. Would you go without your wife?" "Adelaide, you'll be safer here." "I don't care. I want to go with you," she shrieked. Dr. Petrie turned around angrily and was about to rebuke her, but he checked his tongue. Esmeralda said in a quiet voice, "It's all right, let her go. I'd rather stay here anyway." Dr. Petrie said, "Esmeralda," but she shook her head and wouldn't look at him. "Take her," she said. "Go on." Adelaide was mopping her eyes with a handkerchief. Dr. Petrie felt irritated at her outburst, but at the same time, he was almost relieved. Leaving Adelaide behind would have given him the familiar tangles of guilt that he had felt about Margaret. The trouble with being a doctor, he thought, is that even your lovers become your patients. How can I cause Adelaide the same kind of anguish for which other women come to me to be treated? I'm supposed to cure diseases, not spread them. Dr. Petrie sighed. "All right then," he said, almost inaudibly, "if that's what you want." It took them almost 2 hours to get themselves ready. By the time they'd finished, they looked like fat and scruffy astronauts, all wrapped up in quilts and blankets, and tied up with strings and cords. Dr. Petrie had bagged Prickles up completely in a duvet, and he was going to carry her on his back. He and Adelaide were both padded all over, with their thick blanket leggings tucked into 3 pairs of Ivory-Glance's walking socks, and their hands wrapped in gloves and bandages. They had made themselves hoods out of their quilts, covering their faces up completely except for their eyes, which were protected with pieces of nylon mesh cut from a vegetable strainer and safety pinned into place. Dr. Petrie had Kenneth Garnish's automatic pistol tucked into his belt in case of emergencies, and he carried the precious car keys inside his glove. "I'm going to lose pounds," he said in a muffled voice. "It's like a goddamned Turkish bath in this outfit." Kenneth Garnish handed him the glance statistics, securely buckled up in a canvas map case, and shook him by the hand. "Don't forget to send back the choppers," he said with a grin. "I wouldn't like to think I was going to spend the rest of my life in this dump." Dr. Petrie nodded his quilted head. He was already sweating like a mule inside the blankets, and he wanted to get their escape over as quickly as possible. He said goodbye to Nicholas and to Mrs. Garnish, and then he padded over to Esmeralda's room. She was sitting by the window, looking out over the gray light of later afternoon. Through his mesh face mask, she took on a new softness, and he hardly knew what to say to her. She turned and gave a small smile. "You look as if you're off to the North Pole," she said. She came over and took his hand. "As soon as I get to someplace safe, I'll have a helicopter back here straight away," he said. Esmeralda put her hands to her face and looked at him, gently. "Don't worry about me," she said. "You have other things to think about. You know, I believe you could do something really great, Leonard, if you ever gave yourself half a chance." He nodded. "That's what Margaret used to say." "Margaret?" "My ex-wife. She's dead now. She died in the plague." "I'm sorry." "Well, I think the only reason she wanted me to realize my potential was so that she could bask in reflected glory." Esmeralda smiled. He couldn't be sure, because his vision was so blurred, but she might have been crying. "There's only one sort of glory that counts, Leonard," she said, "and that's the glory of survival. You better go now. They're waiting for you." He held out his huge, swaddled arms and held her close. Then he turned around and padded back into the sitting room. Adelaide was waiting for him, all wrapped up, and Prickles was nothing more than a big blue bundle on the settee. "All right, everybody," said Dr. Petrie. "This is it." Kenneth Garnish and Nicholas helped him to get Prickles on his back. She clung around his shoulders, and they tied her firmly in position with a long leather belt from an old suitcase. Nicholas prepared to open the door to let them out. Garnish and his wife held broom handles in case the rats rushed in. "Are you ready?" said Nicholas. Dr. Petrie nodded. "Okay, then. Now." The front door was flung open. The rats scrambled at them like a tide of filthy water, squealing with ravenous hunger. As Dr. Petrie stumbled forward with Prickles on his back, urgently pushing Adelaide in front of him, he could see nothing through his face mask but a torrential swarm of furry bodies filling the hallway and writhing on the stairs. They made the first flight down to the 15th floor, with rats suspended from their quilted shins and hanging from their shoulders. Dr. Petrie kicked the rats around his legs with every other step and tried to smash them against the walls, but even when they were dead, they clung on, until their bodies were pulled away and devoured by more clamoring rats. Adelaide, her arms heavy with the rodents, tripped and fell against the stairs. Dr. Petrie, with Prickles on his back, could do nothing more than nudge her. She managed to struggle up to her feet again, turning and twisting herself to try and shake some of the rats off, but all they did was sway on her arms like over-heavy tassels from a curtain. They made it down to the 12th floor, with rats all over them, gnawing and tearing at their quilts and blankets, and turning them into shambling man-sized beasts of wriggling brown fur. Adele fell again, and Dr. Petrie had to tear rats away from her back to try and reduce their disgusting weight. He was now so overwhelmed by the creatures that he was literally tearing them in half to pull them off. It took them a further 10 minutes to reach the 9th floor. Dr. Petrie was smothered in sweat and panting for breath in the foul air. The building's air conditioning had stopped with a power failure, and the corridors were so soaked in the acrid urine of rats that his eyes smarted and he could hardly make his lungs work. Prickles, clinging to his back, was a muscle-tearing load that he could barely even think about. He waded knee-deep through squirming rats towards the fire door to the next flight of stairs. The door was locked and jammed. Beating rats away from his quilted hood, he forced his way over to Adelaide and shouted, "It's stuck! I can't get it open!" Adelaide stumbled against him. "You have to!" she screamed. "I can't take any more! You have to!" Dr. Petrie peered around the hallway through his face mask. The gilt settee was still wedged in the open elevator door, and he grabbed Adelaide's shoulder and pointed towards the shaft. "Can you climb?" he yelled. "Can you slide down the wires?" She shook her rat-decorated head, making their tails swing. "Leonard, it's 9 stories. I can't." "You'll have to. If you don't, you'll have to go back. Just do what I do." Shifting Prickles higher on his back, Dr. Petrie battled his way through the clinging, tearing rats to reach the elevator doors. He climbed laboriously up onto the settee, and then reached over towards the elevator cables. At the first try, he missed, and for a moment he thought he was going to overbalance. Through his face mask, he could see the dark shaft dropping over 130 feet to the ground. Adjusting Prickles' weight, he reached out again. This time, his gloved hand reached the cable. It was slippery with grease and difficult to cling onto. He reached over with the other hand. His weight made the settee slip a few inches, and he had to pause, stock still, in case it tipped down the shaft completely. Adelaide shrieked, "Hurry, I can't bear it!" Tentatively, Dr. Petrie reached out once more, and this time he managed to grasp the cable with both hands. Sweating and gasping, he pushed himself off the settee and let his legs dangle in space. He then slid awkwardly down beside the settee until he was able to curl his legs around the cable below it and climb down further. "Adelaide!" he shouted. "Adelaide, come on!" He couldn't wait too long for her. He was barely able to keep his grip on the slippery elevator cables as it was, and Prickles was now an agonizing burden of pain. He tried to kick a few rats from his legs, and 2 or 3 of them plummeted down the breezy elevator shaft to the basement, turning over and over as they fell. At last, he saw Adelaide alive with rats, crawling out onto the settee. He saw her peer down the depth of the shaft and hesitate. "It's all right," he yelled. "Just keep your head, and it's all right." Adelaide put her hand out and tried to reach the cable. The settee groaned and shifted downward again, and she held back. Then she tried to reach out once more, her arms heavy with clinging rats. She caught hold of the wire and gripped it. "Now the other one," shouted Dr. Petrie. Adelaide paused, then lunged forward to seize the cable. There was a scraping sound, and the gilt settee tilted under her weight. It slid downwards against the wall for a few feet, and then dropped, with a hideous crashing and banging, 9 stories down to the ground. They heard it hit the bottom and smash. Adelaide was clinging tightly to the wires. She was sobbing out loud, and it took Dr. Petrie several minutes to make her hear. "Slide down slowly," he said. "Hand over hand. Don't go too fast, or the wire will burn through your gloves." "I can't," she wept. "I'm too frightened. I can't." "For Christ's sake, you'll have to. There's no other way." Burdened with rats, Dr. Petrie began his cautious descent. Every few moments he rested, gripping onto the wire, until he felt as if his hands were painfully locked. His face was running with sweat, and his heart felt as if it was grating against his ribcage. He could hear Prickles saying something muffled and shifting about her in her duvet, but there was nothing he could do. He just prayed to God she would try and stay still. They reached the 8th floor. Dr. Petrie paused for another rest. He was breathing in coarse whines, and he was beginning to shake and tremble all over. He was just about to start climbing down again when Adelaide said, "Leonard?" "What is it?" "I can't feel my hands." He tried to look up. "What?" "I can't feel my hands." He blinked sweat out of his eyes. "Try wiggling your fingers." There was a pause. Then she screamed, "I can't feel them." She must have let go. She dropped past him without a sound, knocking him a glancing blow on the shoulder. He didn't hear anything, not even when she hit the ground. He clung on as tightly as he could, a tattered, quilted figure hanging to a wire, and he wept silently as he climbed down floor by floor, one after the other, with his hands bleeding and his body raw with pain. It had just been raining, a flat, Watery sunlight glossed over the wet streets and reflected from windows and spires. Dr. Petrie drove slowly through the broken debris of downtown Manhattan towards the Holland Tunnel, his hands roughly bandaged on the steering wheel, his face strained and exhausted. Prickles, her hair damp with sweat, lay on the seat beside him, fast asleep. On the back shelf of the car, in its canvas map bag, was Ivor Glance's work on plague control by irradiation. As he drove, Dr. Petrie sang softly, under his breath. The day faded into early evening, and early evening faded into night. He drove through the Holland Tunnel and into Jersey. He drove southwest, across a derelict and deserted continent, towards the distant end of the plague zone, if there was one. It seemed, for a while, that the whole of America was his, and that he and Prickles were the only people left alive. It was when he stopped singing that Prickles woke up. She looked at him, in the dim green light of the instrument panel, and he was sweating and pale. "Daddy?" she said. He didn't answer. "Daddy, what's the matter?" Dr. Petrie smiled as much as he could. There was a sharp pain in his groin, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could drive. He gradually slowed the Mercedes down and pulled it in towards the side of the highway. He stopped the car and switched off the engine. They were in Delaware, just outside of Wilmington. The night was dark, and there was the sound of insects from the highway verge. Prickles said, "Daddy, are you sick?" Dr. Petrie shook his head. He touched her honey-colored hair and her serious, beautiful, unpretty face. "Do you know something?" he whispered. She looked at him attentively. The pains were worse, and he was beginning to feel nauseous. "What, Daddy?" she asked when he didn't say anything more. Things seemed to be advancing and receding. Leonard Petrie felt sharp, tearing pains start up in his bowels. He stared at Prickles and said quietly, "You will never forgive us for this." You've been listening to Plague by Graham Masterton, narrated by Russell Bentley. Published by W.F. Howes Limited, this work is copyrighted 1977, Graham Masterton. This recording is copyrighted 2021, Head of Zeus.
Audible hopes you've enjoyed this program.